Hello and welcome back. We're in chapter 7 this time, and we're going to be talking about some of the cognitive aspects of personality. As a cognitive psychologist, I have to apologize for the fact that cognitive psychology doesn't do a really good job of having a super coherent single theory to explain things. We just came off of the chapter where we discussed behavioristic explanations, and we had a good solid Pavlovian conditioning, and we had very solid Skinnerian conditioning, and a little bit of some other behaviorists sort of thrown in at the end. But I mean, really, there's these two main themes. In cognitive psychology, we sort of have lots of explanations for parts of personality and not necessarily a super coherent overarching theory. So just brace yourself for that. All right. Enough warning. All right. So first off, we're going to start off talking about how one aspect of our personality, what might be thought of as a core aspect of our personality, would be how we perceive things. So it's really important to start off by reminding you of something hopefully you learned in your introductory psychology class, which is that perception is how you make sense of the information that's collected by your sensory organs. So here we're looking at a visual stimulus that is being collected by your eyes as the sensory organ. And then it's up to your brain to make sense of what your eyes are collecting. So you've got some principles of Gestalt theory that are being illustrated: closure, proximity, continuation, so on. Those are some Gestalt laws of organization, of how we make sense of information that's coming in through our visual system and figure out what is the important information and what is the information that we can ignore. So the overriding thing that I would like you to take away from this perception and cognition section is the idea that we are always trying to figure out what our environments really mean. What does that sound mean? Like, you might be hearing my heater that just came on in the background. Apparently my heater is so loud, and I might have told you this already, that I got muted in a meeting the other day because I had my mic open. I wasn't saying a word. My heater came on, and the host of the meeting muted me. So I apologize that my heater is so noisy. I'm sitting it's on the outside wall, and I think we are just hearing the system. Anyway, so you might be trying to figure out, what's that noise, right? What does that noise mean? And I have found that in my lectures, if I identify the noise for you, it takes some of the cognitive effort off of trying to pay attention to what I'm saying, even though that noise is present. Like, as long as you know what it is, it's less distracting, right? And that's really an important aspect of cognition, right? That we will spend some of our cognitive effort trying to figure out what's that? What's that thing I'm seeing? What's that thing I'm smelling? Right? I opened my window last night, and it's it's early April as I'm making this recording, and so we had a decent day. Opened up the window to sleep with some fresh air, and I'm like, is that smoke? Is something burning? Right? Is one of my neighbor's houses on fire? Like, why do I smell smoke? Right? When you don't know what it is, what could be the source of that? It really takes up a lot of your cognitive effort, and you spend time trying to figure it out. You spend some of your effort trying to figure it out. That's how we're organized. So the job of our perceptual system is to collect the information from our sensations and make them into something meaningful. So I'm pretty sure you can read that word Gestalt, even though some of those forms that you're looking at aren't even officially letters, or they might even be letters that are actually upside down, but in that context you can figure out what it is. We're always trying to make what we're perceiving or what our sense organs are collecting into something meaningful. We kind of harbor under the delusion that the world is full of meaningful information, and rarely does it contain something that is meaningless. Actually, it's probably inverted. A lot of the things that are out in our environments really are meaningless, and we shouldn't be spending our effort trying to figure out, because it's nothing worth spending our efforts on, but we do it anyway. Gestalt psychologists argued that you can't take a complex stimulus and reduce it down to the sum of its parts and say, oh, it's still the same basic thing. Let's just use the G in the word Gestalt. If you broke that into that curve on the left, the black curve on the left, the white column in the middle, and then those two black shapes that are on the right, and treated them honestly like those were separate things. Curve on the left, white thing in the middle, two black pieces on the right. If you treated them like actually independent elements, they would mean nothing. They would have no meaning. But if instead you look at it holistically, then you recognize, oh, that's actually a G with just maybe a white bar in front of it that's blocking part of the G, right? You perform the perceptual task of closure and you fill in that gap and you go, that's clearly a G. You can't take something complex like a letter or a word or someone's intent and break it down into its elements and still retain the basic gist of what that larger thing is. The Gestalt psychologists actually had a phrase for that. They said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you take that G apart and have a curve, a column, and the two separate black pieces on the right, reorganize them and add them back together. So now let's say you've got a white column on the left, those two pieces that are normally on the right, now they're in the middle, and then that black curve that's normally on the left, put it over on the right. I've summed it all back up. I added it together again, but now it's less than meaningless. Now it's just some kind of abstract shape. It doesn't mean anything. You can't simply add it all back together and come back to the same place that you started necessarily. And that's what the Gestalt psychologist thought was really super important. So one of the Gestalt psychologists was named, it looks like it says Lewin, but his name was pronounced Levin. Levin's field theory is part of the Gestalt model. This idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and that we're always trying to perceive what's going on in our environment. He developed this, I don't even know what to call this model of how information is collected and processed by us in ways that could affect our behavior, which then we would pick up as evidence of personality. So first off, all around in that oval shape, we have the foreign hull of life space. Foreign hull of life space. So this would be the part of the environment that surrounds the individual, but is not part of the individual. So that's what he means by foreign. It's not part of the individual. It's foreign to them. It's separate from them, but it's part of their life space. So this would be like the people that you come into contact with daily. It would be where you live, all the parts of the life space that you come into really frequent contact with, and that probably informs your judgments and your attitudes and stuff like that, but is not internal to you. It's something external. All right. Now, if you look inside that foreign hull of life space, we'll find the individual in that circle. So it says boundary of person. So the outside of that circle is intended to designate this is where the person dwells, is inside this circle. All those little sort of leaf-shaped things inside the boundary of the person, those would be the person's abilities. And there's a bunch of them in there because we all have a whole bunch of different abilities. We have, math ability or singing ability or spatial ability or, just a whole bunch of different things that we have to lesser or greater extent, individually. But we have a bunch of different abilities. And then in the middle is all your needs. And those needs can be psychological needs. Those can be physiological needs. They could be, whatever kind of needs you have. So that's you there in the middle. So quite the likeness, don't you think? It looks exactly like you. So that's you in the middle with all of your abilities surrounding your needs. All right. Now we have vectors. So vectors are driving forces, and they're pressuring you from different angles. And there's probably more than just two vectors pressing on you at any given time, but in his model, he just drew two vectors. So you've got a vector on the left that just says vector driving force. Then you have the one on the right that's called vector restraining force. So You have some vectors that drive you towards your needs, and you have some vectors that are restraining you from pursuing other needs or restraining the environment from fulfilling your needs. So it's kind of complicated. I'm laughing because it's like, in his mind, this drawing probably simplified things. But to a casual observer who doesn't know what Levine is talking about, it's probably kind of confusing. Oh, I forgot to mention that with the foreign hull of the life space, you'll notice that there's a dashed line around the outside of it because that foreign hull is permeable. It has influence outwards into the environment that's even farther away from the individual than the foreign hull is. So that would be, larger sort of environmental contacts that you might have. So it would be like going to school. That would be outside the foreign hull, would be like those classes that you're not part of, or that area of campus that you've never really visited. But you could, and you might have a one-shot experience with it. And so you might have influence on that environment because you joined it. And it might have a little bit of influence on you because you've been there, you've had contact with it. And so it's a little bit permeable on the outside. You'll notice he drew a solid line between the foreign hull of life space and then all that other stuff that's surrounding directly the individual, because he was arguing that there was less interplay between the foreign hull of the life space and all the stuff that's going on inside that solid line. He called that, I keep calling it vague things. You see up in the right-hand corner of that area, he calls it the psychological environment. So the part of the environment that is, impacting your thoughts, your feelings, your cognitions, all that. So there's a barrier that I need to address on the side that says vector restraining force. And that barrier is, either it could be a psychological barrier. You're not paying attention. That would be a psychological barrier to a vector being able to restrain you. You're not noticing that there are limitations on your behavior because you're not paying attention. It could be physical barriers where, one of your needs is that you're hungry, and the vector restraining force is trying to get you not to overeat, but there's a barrier to that but there's a big serving size in this bag that I've opened. And so even though the vector restraining force is trying to get you to only consume, a serving size of those chips, you opened the bag and it came out of the vending machine and implied it was for one person. And you know what? I'm hungry. And so your needs override that vector restraining force because there's this barrier to that restraining force called the size of the bag, right? Like it's here, it's in my hand, it's more pressing than this restraining force would be. I don't know if chips is the best personality example, but it's the one that came to my mind. And then on the far right, you see that there's a positive goal. And one of the things that Levine thought was really important is that we're always striving to achieve whatever our needs are. There's always a goal. So, your psychological need might be to gain accolades or notoriety, right? Like you want people to acknowledge that you were good at something, let's say, or maybe your need is for companionship, and so you need to seek out a friend or something like that. So the goals in those examples would be, accolades or recognition. And in the second one, it would be, the goal would be companionship, finding somebody to spend the evening with so you're not feeling lonely or whatever. So the goal is always, outside of the individual, and it's something that the individual is striving towards. All right, well, hopefully I just described that picture well enough. I found a cartoon that kind of illustrates the barrier issue. We've got this giant barrier, and should I open the door to reality? Levine, as a Gestalt theorist, was a cognitive psychologist who really believed that, we perceive things through our own lenses, right? Our own lens of experience, expectations, biases, attitudes, things like that. And so are we really willing to open the door to reality and find out that maybe some of our cognitions or our perceptions are incorrect? Are we willing to do that, right? Here we have a different kind of take on Levine's field theory that I found that somebody had submitted to an art competition. And what you see here is all these things that are impinging on this artist's psychological environment. You can tell that this is an older artistic rendering because it's got the Iraq War in there, and we're not in that anymore. But I don't think we may have troops there. I shouldn't have said that so confidently. But you have sort of all the things that are out in the environment that are impinging on this individual's sense of self, their boundary, their own psychological environment, and having an impact on the way that they think about things, and how they're striving and how they might behave in any given moment and things like that. So I tried to find a couple of examples in real world depictions, right? This artist is trying to depict, their perceptions or whatever. They kind of illustrate Levine's field theory, I think almost a little bit more clearly than his very well drawn out model really does. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we're going to come back in the next segment. We're going to talk about like some concrete ways to test Levine's field theory. So I will see you in the next video.